The wind swept over the wide brown fields, carrying dust, dry hay, and whispers of the dying sun. The ranch was quiet, except for the creak of the old barn door and the soft sound of a woman's footsteps crunching over the dirt. Her name was Clara May. She wasn't what the town called beautiful. Folks at the saloon called her the fat girl from Cotton Ridge, the one nobody would dance with at the harvest fairs. But Clara didn't care much for dances. She cared for work, for warmth, for food that could make a man forget how cold the world could be. That afternoon, she came walking up to the farmhouse of Henry Colt, a lonely, widowed farmer known for keeping to himself and his land. His hat was old, his hands were cracked, and his eyes had seen too many winters. Clara stood at his fence, clutching a basket. He looked up from the field, wiping sweat from his brow, and squinted at her. "You lost, miss?" he asked. She shook her head, her voice soft but steady. "No, sir. I heard you needed someone to help with your kitchen." He frowned. "Kitchen help? I don't take on hands I can't feed." She smiled faintly, lifting the basket. "I brought my own food." He raised an eyebrow as she set the basket down on the fence post and uncovered it. Steam rose from warm bread, stew, and apple pie, fresh, rich, the kind of meal that could silence a hungry man. Henry stared, speechless for a moment. Clara looked down, then said quietly, "No one marries a fat girl, sir. But I can cook." The wind caught her words, carried them slow through the open field. For a long while he didn't speak. Then he reached over the fence, broke a piece of her bread, and took a bite. His jaw moved slow, thoughtful. The bread was soft, the taste rich with something he hadn't known in years, care. He looked at her again, and something in his weathered face softened, though he said nothing yet. The sky burned gold above them, and the lonely farm waited, silent, as if it knew that two lives had just crossed for a reason. The sun had slipped behind the ridge by the time Henry Colt spoke again. The air had turned colder, the sky painted in streaks of crimson and grey. He stood there, silent as a fence post, chewing slowly, his eyes fixed on the woman who waited without flinching. After a long pause, he said, "You make this yourself?" Clara nodded. "Yes, sir. Every bit of it." He brushed the crumbs from his rough hands and said quietly, "Well, you best come in before it gets dark. Coyotes'll think you're dinner standing out here." She smiled faintly, unsure if it was a joke or an order, but followed him anyway. Inside the farmhouse, the air smelled of wood smoke and loneliness. The walls were bare, except for a faded picture of a woman, Henry's late wife, gone 5 winters ago. Clara placed her basket on the old wooden table, her eyes roaming the small room. One chair, one lantern, one man living with ghosts. She unpacked her food carefully, setting the bread and stew before him. "It ain't fancy," she said softly. Henry grunted. "Don't need fancy, just honest." He sat down, took another bite, and for a moment the silence between them wasn't heavy. It was warm. She stood near the fire, rubbing her hands together, unsure if she should speak. Finally, she said, "They said you don't talk much." He looked up, his eyes catching the firelight. "They say plenty about folks they don't know." Clara smiled, a small, nervous one. "Guess they say plenty about me, too." "I've heard," he said simply, and then, seeing her face fall, added, "But folks' words don't plant wheat or fix fences." "Never cared for talk." She exhaled, a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. The flames crackled, throwing long shadows on the walls. Outside, the coyotes began their night song, distant and lonely. Henry leaned back in his chair, his voice softer now. "You said no one marries you," he said slowly. "You ever think maybe that's 'cause the men around here don't know what they need?" Clara met his eyes. "And what's that, sir?" He smiled, faintly but real this time. "Someone who don't quit when the wind turns cold." The words hung between them, gentle and heavy. She didn't know what to say, so she just looked at him, the way a person does when the world suddenly feels less cruel. That night, for the first time in years, Henry lit a second plate and left the lamp burning longer than usual. Morning came slow over Cotton Ridge, the kind of morning that makes the frost on the fences shine like silver. Smoke rose from Henry's chimney, something the neighbors hadn't seen in months. Clara was already up before dawn, sleeves rolled, apron tight, moving around the kitchen like she'd lived there all her life. The smell of cornbread filled the small room, while Henry chopped wood outside, the sound of his axe echoing through the empty fields. For a brief moment, it felt like a home again. But peace never lasts long in a town that feeds on gossip. By mid-morning, 2 riders came up the dusty trail, Tom Grady and his cousin Luke, ranch hands from the neighboring spread. They stopped near the fence, smirking as Henry wiped his brow and leaned on his axe. "Heard you got yourself some company, Colt," Tom called, grinning. "Didn't think you were the kind for housekeepers." Henry's jaw tightened. "Morning to you too," Luke laughed, nudging his horse forward. "That her in there? The big one from Cotton Ridge? Heard she can cook, but she sure don't fit through a doorway easy." They both laughed, the cruel kind of laughter that turns the air sour. Henry's eyes darkened. He set his axe down slowly, calm as a man about to pray. Clara appeared at the door just then, holding a plate of cornbread, her smile fading as she caught the looks on their faces. She stood silent, shoulders stiff, eyes burning, though she didn't speak. Henry took a few steps forward, boots crunching over the frost, until he stood by the fence. "You boys done?" he asked, voice low. Tom smirked. "Just saying, Colt, you could do better. Plenty of pretty gals in town." Henry's hand shot out faster than a rattlesnake. He grabbed Tom's collar and yanked him halfway off his saddle. "Pretty don't feed a man," he growled. "Pretty don't patch a coat or stand by you when the barn roof caves in. You boys laugh 'cause you never been hungry a day in your life." Luke reached for his reins. Uneasy now, but Henry's voice rose, not angry, just hard as iron. "You ride back and tell the others, this ranch don't need their jokes. And if I ever hear another word about that woman inside, I'll make sure you're eating dirt before sundown." He let Tom go, dusting his hands like he'd shaken off the last bit of patience he had left. The 2 men rode off quick, their laughter gone, swallowed by the cold wind. Henry turned back toward the porch. Clara was still standing there, eyes wide, the plate trembling slightly in her hands. He walked up to her, took the plate gently, and said in his quiet way, "Reckon this cornbread's gonna get cold." She stared at him, tears forming but never falling. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. He shook his head. "No, ma'am, I did. You stood up to this land. Least I can do is stand up to fools." She looked down, then smiled, small and trembling. Inside, the fire crackled again, and for the first time the house felt alive. Out beyond the fence, the wind carried their story across the plains, a story of a man who found warmth again, and a woman who no longer felt ashamed of her shadow.